everyone, Rob here with something a little different. We don't do a lot of navel gazing on this show. We don't even tell you what episode number we're up to, let alone celebrate milestones or basically much looking backwards at all. But once in a while, I think something comes along that's a bit special and different and forces our hand to look back. That thing today specifically is Doctor Who Am I?, a British documentary film about the legacy of the 1996 Doctor Who TV movie, its writer, Matthew Jacobs, and American Doctor Who fandom. It launched for a cinema run in the UK at the end of October and will be getting a home media release at the end of this month, I'm reliably told, and I'll be buying one. But what's the connection to the Doctor Who show? Well, back when we were the Who Wars podcast, now this is pre-Dave as my co-host and a totally different team of people contributing segments to what I likened to an audio fanzine at the time, one of our contributors, Kate, interviewed Matthew Jacobs. Now, this is back in August of 2015, and Matthew was talking at length about the kind of documentary he was working on. It already had the Doctor Who Am I title back then, and all sorts of commentary on the documentary and his background with Doctor Who in general that was interesting then, and I think maybe even more interesting now that people can actually see the documentary. The original interview runs about 40 minutes on the Who Wars episode, so what I've done here is made some edits to the original, keeping it pretty tight and mostly just the parts about Doctor Who. If you like what you hear and want to hear more, such as Matthew working on the Disney film The Emperor's New Groove, or working with George Lucas on the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, or later on a Star Wars video game, hop over to our website and search the word Jacobs and you'll find the episode pretty fast. And can I tell you, there's an especially funny story about the first time Matthew met George Lucas, and I smiled when I heard it again today while editing this piece. I've left stuff like that in the original for the diehards among you to search out and dig into. And now, without any further ado, sit back, relax, and hear from Matthew Jacobs 7 years ago, but bang on target when it comes to the Doctor Who Am I documentary, which is making the news this month. Enjoy.
Okay, so we have a lot to talk about. You've got Doctor Who and Star Wars connections. Let's start with the question, Star Wars or Doctor Who?
Oh, I have to say Doctor Who. I have to say Doctor Who at the end of the day. I mean, I love the Star Wars world, but my involvement in it is a little peripheral. I merely wrote one of the games, Star Wars Starfighter. I have a friendship and worked for a long time with George Lucas, so that was very, very important to me. But when it came to stuff that means more to me, it has to be Doctor Who. Doctor Who was part of my life, at least my conscious life, all the way from in 1963. And then when I got the opportunity to write and co-produce a new Doctor after it had been away, try and set it up as an American show. It was like a dream come true. So that obviously means more to me.
So what is your first Doctor Who memory then?
Well, my first Doctor Who memory, I suppose, I've got vague memories of coming home and we would watch Doctor Who on a Saturday afternoon after doing the shopping, very much behind the sofa kind of memories where it was a pretty scary show. But one of my early memories that my dad was in it. My dad played Doc Holliday in Gunfighters, and I was a very little boy then, and it was part of I don't know if I was that little. I think I was about 9. I don't know. Anyway, it was still William Hartnell. And and my dad took me to the studio as a birthday treat. That was obviously, that's really ingrained quite vividly in my mind, being there really with my two of my biggest heroes. That was my dad and that was the Doctor.
So what was the progression then, like from watching the show as a kid and then actually getting to do it as a career?
Gosh. Do you want my biography? I think the thing is that you have a desire, certainly if you are in a family where the possibility of being involved in creating shows is there from the beginning. My dad was an actor. I think it was very early days, when I was, 10, 11, 12, and I started out as a child actor. Even then, I was thinking to myself, wouldn't it be fantastic if one day I got involved in making these things? And the Doctor was certainly one of those things I imagined myself as being involved in. So I think the sort of, you can say the bigger leap happened there when I was started to imagine that this thing could be a reality, could be a possibility. And once you've got that as a goal, then you just keep going toward it. I mean, that's just the way it works.
Okay, so let's talk about the movie then. So you wrote and co-produced the 1996 Doctor Who movie with the Eighth Doctor.
That's right. Paul McGann's Doctor.
Exactly. So what was your initial brief, and how was that different than the final broadcast?
My initial brief was to bring it to life as a TV movie that could be used as a backdoor pilot, which means that the film was being made by the TV movie division at Fox and not by the series division. And if it was very successful, then it stood a chance of being picked up, not only by Fox, but also by Universal, and made into a series. And when I was brought on after Philip Segal had been trying for a couple of years, to set up a series at Universal. And he hadn't succeeded as the series, and the writers hadn't written stuff that pleased both the BBC and Universal, or any of the people who were attached at that time. And so then they went to Fox, and at Fox, the head of TV movies was a man called Trevor Walton, who I knew from my time at the National Youth Theatre. We'd both been actors together, and we'd encountered each other at various times, and he knew of my work. Amblin, which was sort of peripherally involved, knew of my work. The BBC certainly did. I'd done a few things for them. The only people who didn't really know my work was Universal, even though they'd seen a bit of it via Young Indy. So the door was fairly open. Basically, I got a call. How do you introduce Doctor Who to America in general? To the larger American population. There was already quite a considerable fan following at that time. But, putting it out on network TV meant, how do you do that? And so my original pitch, which was basically Doctor Who Am I? And the show basically being about the Doctor being regenerated in such a way as he can't remember who or what he is, and the show being about him trying to work out who he is, and only getting so far. That was the original pitch. And then it got built out into Doctor Who Am I? Once he finds out who he is, then he has to save the world. So I suppose the save the world part, the action part of it, was the bit that was a little different to the original pitch and the first couple of outlines and drafts that I did. First couple of outlines and drafts that I did were much more personal stories relating to the companions and less of the sort of master complex plot stuff, though there was an element of that, obviously.
So were you involved in any further stories or outlines if it had turned into a pilot?
Well, it was regarded as like I said, a backdoor pilot. Mm-hmm. We didn't put together a Bible beyond the Bible that had already been written, but the Bible that had already been written would have been irrelevant. Everything kind of hinged on the viewing figures and the degree to which the two network and production company and studio really wanted to do it. So when we lost the night to Roseanne, we immediately knew we weren't going to be picked up. And BBC at that time didn't really value Doctor Who in the same way as they do now, or they did later in like 2004. At that time, in the early 90s, the BBC were pretty reluctant even to bring the Doctor back.
So have you kept up with any of the Paul McGann Eighth Doctor stories since then?
No, not really. A little bit here and there, but not really. I mean, after the show wasn't picked up, and there was a lot of blame thrown in my direction, not so much at Paul, even though I'd written his character and worked with him and everything like that. People basically said, when they were finding fault with the show, they said the writing was at fault. And yes, it was a bit of a mix, and the second half of the film is a sort of a compromise between many different voices. So I felt a little distant from it and didn't want to go to conventions. So I backed away from that world, really. And also I'd been doing a lot of big franchise stuff. So I was more interested in pursuing. That was around the time I was really working hard on Emperor's New Groove and on other stuff, So I backed away from the world of Doctor Who. That was what happened. So as a result, even when the new show came out, I didn't really watch it until quite recently. Until suddenly they had the 50th celebration, and when the Eighth Doctor was brought back for Night of the Doctor, I was really touched. I was really kind of pleased that Moffat had brought the Doctor back brought our Doctor, the Eighth Doctor, back in such a sort of vivid and in a way, many ways, a very faithful way to the nature of Paul's Doctor. So at that point, I started getting interested again, and I caught up and watched shows and loved it.
Cool. So you wrote the movie in 1996. And then you didn't ever go to a con or anything like that until 2015, correct?
That's correct. And in 2015, I got invited. Initially, I got invited after, in sort of like 2014, I was being invited to various things, but the main invitation had come from a tiny little rinky-dink convention in Jacksonville, Florida, which ended up backfiring and becoming a mess, basically because the guy who was running it was kind of a little dubious, and he cancelled it and ran off with the money. And at that point, that was all over a certain section of the internet, and that was when Sean Lyon, who runs Gallifrey One, contacted me. I had not even really wanted to go to the Jacksonville one, but I've been making these small films recently. A couple of big animated films, but I've been primarily making these rather smaller films. One of my collaborators, Vanessa Yule, who is a very good documentary filmmaker in her own right and works with me when I'm directing and acting. And we have a good, strong, creative relationship. She turned around and she said, Matthew, there's a real documentary here to be made about you going back into a world. And I said, well, actually, I think there's a documentary here that's really about the American fan of Doctor Who. And I've never seen a film that really goes into the nature of American fans and why Americans like the show.
So that brings us to the documentary, Doctor Who Am I?
Well, Doctor Who Am I, that became, obviously, the title is loaded in all different ways. It became basically one of those documentaries where I'm going on an adventure that's both a personal one, but primarily one of exploration, where I'm finding out about the nature of fandom. And so far, it's been quite a ride. It's really interesting, and the 5 days at the convention were fantastic. There were all sorts of interesting issues that were brought up during those days. We've been filming a little more that explores each of those issues. We've been cutting it. Our aim is to have an interesting feature film that speaks not just to Doctor Who fans, but to people who are interested in the amazing growth of the power of American fans. American fans are incredibly powerful at the moment, not just of Doctor Who, but all the other sci-fi and fantasy material that's out there.
So what do you think was your biggest revelation during this whole process?
Well, I'm not at the end of it yet.
Oh, okay.
There may be more, but certainly when I was in, and it was a revelation I should have seen coming anyway, I had been quite afraid of facing the music, as it were, and going back to Gallifrey, and I had nothing to be afraid of. And fans aren't going to trash you. They're fans, and they have interesting stuff to say that goes beyond the show. I think that was the biggest revelation, which is that really these shows are catalysts for something bigger, something that's that is going on. People like to sort of gather together and exchange ideas. It's community, and the shows themselves, the way in they're the pathway to a bigger thing, which is a sense of community and a bunch of ideas to a degree. I think with the Doctor, it's a sort of kind of a bit deeper than the Marvel characters. I think with the Doctor, because there's a question behind him, and there is he does good, basically, and he regenerates. There's almost a sort of theological basis to his following that is probably more prevalent, I think, maybe in America than it is in other countries like Korea, China, India, Australia, Britain, all the other places where Doctor is followed. I don't know for sure, but I certainly know that when I wrote the movie and I said that he was half human, it's like I was committing sacrilege. Because the film, there will be some Doctor Who stars involved in it, but the film is primarily about the fans. There are like star fans. There are like people who are like number one fans for whatever reason there are. But there are also the regular fans, and there are people who are just followers of the show. It's really about them. That's why it's called an intimate portrait of the American fan. It's about me getting to know a whole bunch of people, and they kind of take over the story at the moment, which is good, which is the way it should go.
Well, thanks so much for taking the time.
Okay, thank you so much for interviewing me. Seriously, it's always nice, and I want people to look out for Doctor Who Am I. I think it's going to be something people will want to see.
Do you want to tell people one more time, like where they can find you and all that kind of stuff?
DoctorWhoAmI.com. Just those words all run together, and look for it on Twitter, and look for its Facebook page. It won't be hard to find.
Allons-y, and may the force be with you.
You too.
You've been listening to
The Doctor Who Show with Rob and Dave.
Find us online by searching for
The Doctor Who Show.
We also love it when you write in. Drop us a line anytime at hello@thedwshow.net.